Was im Iran passiert, bewegt Menschen auf der ganzen Welt, und sollte es wirklich so sein, dass das Regime, das 1979 mit der Islamischen Revolution an die Macht kam, wankt? Und was plant Donald Trump? Wird er vielleicht doch noch militärisch eingreifen im Iran, oder welchen Druck kann er sonst auf die Mullahs ausüben? Drängende, aktuelle Fragen, und die würde ich gerne einmal von israelischer Perspektive aus betrachten, denn Israel spielt in diesem ganzen Machtgefüge und auch in dieser Krise eine zentrale Rolle. Und deswegen habe ich für diese Folge meines Podcasts mit der israelischen Sicherheitsexpertin Ori Rabinowitz gesprochen. They say that history is written in decades, but sometimes it is forged in a matter of days. For Iran, we're currently witnessing such a moment, a convergence of internal pressure, geopolitical shifts, and an economic challenge that has brought the nation to a critical crossroads. Today, we will explore why these are truly the decisive days that could reshape the future of the Middle East. And I'm joined by Ori Rabinowitz, a visiting scholar at Stanford Center for International Security and Cooperation and an associate professor of international relations at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Hi, Ori.
Hi, thank you for having me.
When we look at what's going on right now in Iran, from what we can say and judge, has the momentum of Iran's protest movement already faded, or has it simply shifted into a quieter, less visible form of resistance?
I think it's a terrific question. It's basically what's on everyone's mind, and I want to advise caution before I answer. The media blackout is so powerful and so effective that it's really difficult to properly follow what's going on in Iran. The only media that has been allowed access to the internet is the channels that are propped up by the regime. So very tentatively, I would say that the picture that emerges kind of indicates perhaps a slowing down of the momentum. But again, I want to urge caution. This could be a ploy or a propaganda. We're not in a situation where we can properly judge what's going on. And I think the Iranians and the rest of the world is waiting to see what President Trump is planning to do.
There were reports in the last 2 or 3 days that the Israelis actually advised the US administration against a strike on Iran. Sounds that reliable to you?
Again, I would urge a lot of caution. What we tend to be seeing now is a sort of a rift between, I think, where Israel stands and where some of the US allies in the Gulf stand. I think the Israelis would very much like to see some sort of a strong reaction by Trump, not necessarily a specific one. I haven't seen in the Israeli media calls for specific kind of action, and I'm sure these things are actually discussed very privately, and I would be surprised if they pop up in the news. But what we have been seeing is that the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia and some other Gulf actors are quite concerned with the possibility of escalation in possible U.S. strikes on Iran. This has to do with several obvious reasons. First of all, they're closer to Iran. It would be easier for Iran to launch missile and drone attacks into the territories of the neighboring countries. But also, if Iran descends into chaos and turmoil, the immediate neighbors would be the one that would have to bear the brunt of this. So, for example, imagine a lot of refugees. Imagine violence spilling over. So I think it makes sense for Iran's closer neighbors to be a lot more cautious about it. That being said, it seems to me that a lot of the actors in the region would like to see the Iranian Islamic regime topple. The question is, who will replace it and what are the risks that would be involved in that?
Why is it still so strong, that regime? I mean, it's been under pressure for so many years already from its own population. It's isolated, but it still clinges on to power. How does that actually work?
The answer to your excellent question is actually in the wording of the question itself. You mentioned that they've managed to stay in power for so long. It's true, and some people forget that the Iranian regime has now been in power since 1979, that is longer than the entire duration of the Cold War, which is amazing. And that longevity basically gave them tools and time to adapt and to figure out what the best tactics to remain in power and to cling to power, as you correctly said. And the answer that they came up with is extreme brutality. they're willing to quench any kind of resistance and any kind of protest in the harshest means necessary. They have no problem with gunning down the protesters, as we unfortunately saw in the past week. I would say that a complementary answer is the fact that it's not a personalist regime, a classical personalist regime. The regime will not disappear if the supreme leader Ali Khamenei dies tomorrow or quits tomorrow. We're talking about a very robust regime. We have the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, we have the Basij militia. So hundreds of thousands of Iranians that belong to the regime have benefited from it. It's a regime that systematically robs its own people. So the livelihoods of these hundreds of thousands of people that are directly linked to the regime, their livelihoods, and also, by the way, their lives. I mean, if the regime topples, their lives would be at great risk, at least some of them. So they're powerful, they're strong, they're willing to use force, and they're very experienced in it.
We are looking at it from a very Western perspective, but you, as someone who comes from the Middle East, from the region, from Israel, can you explain what Israel's interest is in this conflict? What would be your best possible out of this crisis, and what are you fearing?
So I think in terms of context, when we approach this excellent question, it's very important to remember that before 1979, Israel and Iran under the Persian Shah were actually closely aligned. There's no strategic reasons for these actors to actually be so hostile to each other. They don't share a border. They're thousands of kilometers. The capitals are thousands of kilometers away from each other. The hostility was basically born in 1979 as the Iranian Revolution based itself and the Iranian Revolutionary Guards took power. This is not something that would be easily dealt with because the animosity that the regime feels towards Israel is the heart of its ideology. They're quite anti-Semitic, they're terribly anti-Israeli, and it's not something that you can just negotiate away. It's a major plank of their ideology. That being said, the hostility between the two is such that the Israelis would love to see the Iranian regime, the Islamic regime, topple and fall. And it would certainly cause a lot of champagne bottles to open all across Israel if that regime is toppled. However, there are also a lot of risks involved because that specific regime also happens to have a lot of ballistic missiles, and they're not afraid to use them, as we saw in the June war, where more than 500 Iranian ballistic missiles rained down on Tel Aviv, and drones, and Iran also has some residue proxy capacity. Hezbollah is not as powerful as it was before September 24, but it's still around, as are some of the other proxies. So while the Israelis would love to see the Iranian Islamic regime topple, they still urge caution.
And what role does Israel play? I just said that the Trump administration is often advised by Israel how to act in the Middle East. And is it kind of playing the cards behind the curtain? Or how would you describe how pivotal Israel as a player in the region is when it comes to Iran?
Israel is certainly a very pivotal player, but I think what we've seen from the Trump administration is the fact that it is also quite focused on relationship with Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the Gulf. I think that to a great extent, Israel in the last year has lost its primacy as the closest actor to the US. It's quite, I think you could describe the situation in the following terms. I think if the understanding was that if you're in the room with Israel, if you're an Arab actor and you're in the room with Israel, you're also in the room with the US, and this was the understanding in the previous decades. Now I think if you're in the room with Qatar, if you're in the room with Saudi Arabia, you're almost just as much in the room with the US. I think that these actors are very strong ties to the Trump administration. Erdogan in Turkey also has somewhat of a close relationship with Trump, so it's difficult to gauge who will actually end up winning the president's ear. I'm sure all these actors are now busy trying to influence Trump, to share their analysis with Trump. Currently, by the way, if we follow the news and if we assume that Trump isn't busy trying to deceive the Iranians with a smart deception plan, it looks like what the Qataris and the Saudis have consulted him was the advice that he ended up actually taking. And I wouldn't be surprised if we'd see in the coming weeks and days statements from Israel indicating disappointment with the fact that Trump didn't actually push the regime further to its knees. I think in the coming days and weeks, we'll see a disappointment from the Israel establishment's point of view, and I expect we'll see statements following these lines, because from the Israeli perspective, this has been a unique window of opportunity to really bring down the regime. The regime itself is with its back against its wall, and I think that statements from Israel would indicate disappointment. The question is, what was in Trump's toolkit to begin with?
Let me come to another point, because I think there is a new alignment emerging between the Gulf states in particular and Israel. We know the Abraham Accords, but also when it comes to security matters, I think, have seen quite clearly that there has been some kind of cooperation in the past couple of years, also when it comes to us, at least with the United Arab Emirates and so on. How historical is this development for Israel?
It depends on how it will unfold against our observing eyes. If everyone agrees that this is likely the death knell or the death spiral of the regime, and in Iran, of course. And the big question is, how long will this death spiral unfold for? So let's just give viewers and listeners some historical context, right? So Constantin, you know this better than me. When the Berlin Wall fell down, it took a year until Germany was fully reunited, and the Soviet Union only fell the following summer, right? The summer of 91. These processes tend to take a lot of time. In 2012, Israeli Defense Minister Ehud Barak said that the Assad regime was breathing its last breaths, and it took 12 more years. We can give various other examples. In some cases, yes, these regime changes take place very swiftly, and the regimes can topple, but we actually don't know how long this last final stage of this current regime will take. And this entails a lot of risks.
But coming back to what you just said, that Israel may express discontent about the action that is, it's not taking place right now when it comes to Iran. So that means that Israel would have wanted the US to strike, to go in and blow the regime up.
So we don't know. The Israelis have been very careful about not voicing their opinions, not voicing any statements. Israel does not want to be officially linked to the protest, or it doesn't want to enable the Iranian regime to say this is an Israeli propaganda, these are not authentic ploys. So the Israeli officially have been very careful. I think it's likely that some, at least in the Israeli leadership, really do want to see Trump carry out some form of a strike that will bring the regime down. However, just like the Americans, it's not clear to me, and I'm guessing it's also probably not clear to the Israelis, what kind of strikes would be effective strikes. What kind of a military measure, if at all, would be a measure that's likely to topple a regime, a strong, powerful regime like the one in Iran. Some scholars and some policy pundits argue that instead of taking military action, and I'm sure that some in the Israeli leadership also agree with these assessments, that the Trump administration should take non-military action. For example, expelling Iranian diplomats that are affiliated with the current regime, locking down bank accounts, taking in diplomatic international measures. So we can basically outline a host of other measures. My guess is that many in the Israeli leadership would have liked to see Trump take military action and bring the regime down, but the Israelis officially are very quiet, and we haven't seen official statements on that. So this is based on my analytical assumption, observation. We're not citing official Israeli sources.
Yes, a security analyst. Is there any tactic, any military action that you could imagine that could really bring the regime down swiftly?
If I knew this question, I would be a very rich person, if I know it definitely. Every military action entails risk-taking. A couple of weeks ago, most military and security analysts would have guessed, I think, that the US cannot just go in Venezuela and capture Nicolás Maduro and his wife without sustaining any kind of injuries to their own forces. Tactically speaking, it has been a very effective operation. The question of what happens now with Venezuela is a separate, very important question. So as of now, it's very difficult to imagine one single operation that can take the entire regime down. It's quite possible that the Americans are planning something that would surprise us all, me included. the problem is the fact that the regime is actually so wide. Even if we take out Khamenei, the Iranian supreme leader himself, there are enough people that can fill his shoes. The regime is not a personalist regime. It doesn't necessarily rest on the fate of Khamenei himself. There are enough Iranian Revolutionary Guards officials that can take up the position, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be one supreme leader. It could be a group, right? It could be a revolutionary council. It could be a couple of generals. And then the question is, who would you target? Would you target each and any police station in Iran? Would you target each and any military base? So it's very, very difficult to see a military operation that can bring down the regime.
If I were Trump and I want a yes or a no from someone who advises me like you in this case, the bottom line, you would say strike, yes or no?
Strike smartly and make sure that the protesters know that you have their back, because they're the ones that are going to bring down the regime. Any military strike is just going to be the force pushing it forward.
Okay, so that's clear. And you also said that lots of champagne bottles will pop in case of the regime falling in Israel. And indeed, also in Europe and Germany, we've seen protesters, Iranian and Jewish protesters side by side, demonstrating in the streets, something that's really, from my point of view, amazing when you see the kind of hostility that's often out here in the Middle East. So what does that do to you? I mean, do you also feel that sort of, how do you look at it?
I look at it from a very biased Israeli perspective. Where you sit is where you stand. I think that only people who are ignorant about the history of the Middle East can imagine that the Iranian people, as a people, detached from their leadership, have any kind of animosity or hostility towards Israel or the Jews. The two peoples have had a very long, rich, detailed history. And the other thing, of course, in which we haven't had time to discuss is the role of the Gaza war in this conflict. And I think what we see now unfolding around the world is the global left's reluctance to call out the Iranian regime and its brutality because it's perceived to be standing up with Israel, which I think is an unbelievable double standard and an ethical, moral stain.
Absolutely. Well, that's something I published an article recently about. Well, what I also see online is that there are accusations that these protests in Iran, they are all Israeli agents and they are orchestrated by Israel. I mean, of course, we know that's all rubbish, but who is fueling this? Where does it come from? And I see people who believe it. It is not that it's just bots, but I personally know a few people, and I've seen them in Germany who believe this propaganda. So how does that work?
First of all, I just want to say that the word bots in Hebrew means mud, and I think that in this specific system, both interpretations are very apt. The Iranian regime itself is fueling these rumors. They want to delegitimize the protests. They want to portray the protests as not authentic, not organic, but a part of a huge Mossad ploy by Israel to undermine the regime. I think you'd have to be quite ignorant to believe it. If Israel had the power to get 500,000 Mossad agents on the ground in Iran, would probably not be in this specific situation. That's, of course, a tongue-in-cheek remark, but disregarding how painful the last couple of weeks have been to the Iranian protesters and disregarding or ignoring how evil and brutal this regime had been to its own population in the past few decades, is really something that's unforgivable. This is a regime that executes its own people in unbelievable rates. It's an abusive regime towards the women of the republic, towards the entire population in general. And the plight of the Iranians is real, and people should take heed of it.
So now comes the crucial question. You referred to someone saying 12 years ago, it was, I think, about the Assad regime many years before it actually fell, that he predicted it would be or would happen within weeks. Now I'm asking you, how long do you give the regime in Tehran to survive? How much time is left for them?
No, since I'm an academic, I happily don't have to answer these questions. Perhaps if I was, employed by an intelligence service, I would have to do. I think I'm going to give it 50-50, that they would survive the coming year. We'll see.
Ori Rabinowitz, many thanks for your time and your expertise. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Soweit diese Folge meines Podcasts. Mich würde interessieren, wie ihr auf den Iran blickt. Was fühlt ihr, wenn ihr seht, wie viel die Menschen dort riskieren, der Mut, wie das Regime mit denen umgeht? Das schreibt gerne in die Kommentare und abonniert auch gerne meinen Kanal. Und dann hören wir uns beim nächsten Mal wieder.